G'day, my name's Michael Koziarski. As Ben mentioned, I'm a member of the Ruby on Rails core team. I shall make sure that my clicker does what I'm expecting. For those of you who have never sort of dealt with an open source project, I guess the nearest role, the nearest thing in the kind of commercial world is, I don't know, some kind of steering committee or something like that. So most of the work on Rails actually happens by some 1,000-odd distinct contributors that have contributed work over the last couple of years. The core team is in charge of sort of doing all of the big stuff and sort of corralling and helping and sort of growing that community and helping people contribute. I'm also involved in a bunch of other open source stuff, but to be fair, none of it is particularly interesting and most of it is fairly trivial contributions. So when you sort of look at my GitHub homepage, there's forks of some libraries that I've fixed bugs in. And even in my Rails work these days, in fact, most of what I do is acting as the security coordinator. So for anyone who's ever received one of those horrible sort of bug track emails which says, there is a vulnerability in this thing that you use everywhere, you are fucked, your day is ruined, and you have to fix all of these bugs and do these 20 different steps because some guy in New Zealand messed up. Generally, I'm the person who writes that email, who handles that, and gets all of the lovely emails in reply. In terms of what I do for a living, I'm a partner at Southgate Labs. Now, we kind of struggle to describe what it is that we actually do. We're some kind of combination of an early stage technology investment firm and programmers. So if you can think of a cool way to describe that, that's good. I mean, in essence, we do consulting work, we do a little bit of our own product work, and then we work with the ventures that we've either invested in or have just been involved with for a long time to kind of help them grow. So most of the stuff that I deal with on a daily basis in terms of programming is for websites, mobile apps, things like that. I'm not building ERP systems or CRM systems or whatever all those other horrible things are that you guys probably have to do for a living. What takes up most of my time these days, though, is my family. This is a photo from this weekend. So we have two lovely girls, one of whom is 6 weeks old. And for anyone who knows what it's like to have a kid who's 6 weeks old, I'm probably pretty tired. And I'm apologizing in advance if I just kind of doze off and fall asleep. That's my excuse. So, in order to sort of get everyone on the same page, how many people here have used Rails before or use it now? And how many of you know basically what it is? Cool, okay, roughly as I expected. So, in that case, I'm going to give you guys a brief history of Rails, which is horribly, horribly biased. So, before there was this great thing called Ruby on Rails, people built web applications that looked like this. They had hundreds of inputs, they run on horrible databases by horrible companies. You draw these kind of things and you'd have, you know, workflow processes, and you'd have this idea that somehow you'd have code that wasn't code and it would get deployed to some kind of stupid engine that some expensive company would love to sell you, and you'd edit things like this. And the theory was out would pop a great application, but in reality what we mostly spent our time doing was writing XML to wire up, you know, oh look, I want the show action to render the show JSP page. I should have to write 50 lines of bollocks to get that to work. I want the appointments to be stored in the appointments table. I want the ID to be called ID, and I would like the title to be called title. Now, thankfully, we came along, and you guys have a much better life now. So after Rails, we all work on applications. Everyone in the entire world works on applications that look like this. They're really nice. They sort of change the world. They topple corrupt governments, is I believe the claim to fame that we can have now. And even the people who, for some inexplicable reason, chose not to build their stuff in Rails, like this is Vend, one of our portfolio companies. For some bizarre reason, they're a PHP app. They use technology which basically looks and works and feels like Rails. So before we came along, people kind of expected that to be a software developer was some kind of life of suffering. It had to be hard. You had to do a bunch of nonsense. And that kind of nonsense that you had to do, the configuration, the why does it take 10 minutes for my app server to boot, all of that was the reason that we were paid well. And similarly, Xero, they've got a lovely, they use .NET for some reason, and again, they get to use those same kind of key, they don't use our technology, but they use our kind of approaches of, actually this thing doesn't have to be hard, it can be fun, and we can kind of enjoy ourselves. And so coding in Rails looks like this. You just write your classes, you write your actions. There's really not a whole lot to be done, and the configuration is non-existent on the whole. That's obviously a PR spin lie, but you'll enjoy it. Now, I've been doing this for a very long time. In the scheme of things, 6 years. When I started contributing to Rails, I looked like this, and now I look like this. And so kind of along the way from being a shaggy-haired 20-something who had no idea about lighting and cameras and photos to a balding 30-something who has 2 children, I've learned a lot of lessons about how best for me to manage an open source project. And what I thought I'd try to talk about today is how the lessons that I've learned can translate into lessons for you if you want to either be a contributor to an open source project or even just use code that's developed in this kind of community and collaborative manner. So the gist is I want to kind of help you guys understand my perspective on things. Now, my perspective is slightly warped, obviously. Like I say, I've been doing this for a long time, and we've been a pretty successful project and have been able to sort of avoid a whole lot of things which other projects have had to struggle with in terms of getting attention and everything else. We came along at the right time and sort of answered that. But I still hope that the lessons which I'm going to cover now are things that every open source contributor and every open source maintainer and every project lead and all these kind of people actually have learned these lessons themselves. Even if they haven't kind of come to the conclusions that I have, they'll still kind of react in the same way that I will, even if it's just this kind of deep, visceral thing. So the first lesson that we have as open source project maintainers, and that I have learned in particular, is that by far the most important people to listen to for features that you should be adding to your application are the users. And the reason that we do that is because the users are the people who are going to give us the best indication of what's currently broken in our processes, what things it would be nice to enhance. These are the people who use our stuff every single day. They know much more about what sucks and what rules than someone who's read about it in a magazine or a CIO at a bank somewhere or an analyst at Gartner's. And incidentally, if you've ever worked on an open source project which has had research reports put out by these large organizations, it becomes ridiculous, the idea that anyone is paying them for that nonsense that they put out. It's just embarrassing. So if you work for a company which is subsidizing that whole industry, just please try to stop. So users say things like this: it'd be cool if blah, 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 you had Ajax support. It's a little bit annoying how I have to run this command before I can run this other. Why do I have to do this particular thing in this order? And even better, some users will say, here's a patch that implements this particular piece of functionality that I want to have. So that's all great. This is not what someone who's a user of ours would say. I'll never use your software until, and this is the kind of thing that you'll actually get a lot of when you're an open source maintainer, or I assume if you're maintaining commercial libraries as well. I mean, before I did this, I worked in banks, so we didn't have to listen to anyone. And but I assume that commercial maintainers get this as well, that people say, well, I'm never going to use your software until it's more modular, has this kind of computer science nonsense, it has internationalization, it supports a real database. We got that one a lot in the early days. Rails, I mean, it looks pretty cool in terms of a website, but until it can run on Oracle or DB2, then it's just, I'm not going to touch it. Runs on Windows 8, supports the enterprise, you stop swearing at conferences. We hear all of these kind of things, and once you're maintaining something that's popular, especially, you start getting this a lot. People are saying, well, I'm never going to use your thing until you do this thing for me. Now, the reality is that it's actually a trap. What they're really saying is, I'll never use your software at all, under any circumstances, and I just need to sort of retrofit an explanation to that to justify to myself why I'm not actually going to use this thing, which I sort of logically know is better. So it took us a while to learn this, and one of the misfeatures that we had as a result was SOAP support. So those of you who do Microsoft stuff probably still do SOAP, but no one else in the world has done it for years because it was a terrible, terrible idea. And back in the sort of 1.1, 1.0 kind of days, we had a lot of people saying, I would love to use Rails in order to build my web apps, but I've got to talk to this SOAP API that I have internally. And so we sort of thought, oh yeah, that sounds kind of cool. A guy from Auckland, in fact, built it, submitted it to us, kind of worked. We didn't really use it, but hey, check it out, we've got SOAP support now, we can tick that. And all those people who were going to use Rails once we had SOAP support, well, now they can use Rails, and none of them did. So, the lesson that I hope you guys can take away from this is that when you're trying to interact with an open source maintainer, if you're trying to get something out of this or have a question or a bug or a missing feature or something, the way you want to describe it, the way you want to phrase your questions are kind of like, how would I go about adding this particular function? Has anyone tried fixing this particular bug? What you don't want to do is start saying things like, well, I can't use this until it's going to do this thing, so fix it, I demand it. And if you avoid that kind of thing, you'll find yourself getting much more sort of productive responses. You know, we get things like this, Rails is useless, it doesn't do this, ha 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 ha. Or this is a quote from a comment on one of our GitHub change sets. Now, GitHub has this magical feature where you can comment on anything. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have followed me on Twitter, but my opinion of comments is that they're terrible always and are never of any value, and GitHub is a great example of why that's true. Occasionally, you'll get some great little, hey, have you considered the fact that you're not handling if you pass nil here? But most of the time, it's people like this finding some line of code that they disagree with for no apparent reason, and saying, this is the very reason I don't use Rails, and I know there are lots of people out there who think like me. But when we get contributions like this, or contributions is kind of charitable, when we get bile like this kind of thrown at us, this is what I see. This is blah, 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 blah. I don't use Rails, blah, 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 blah. So if you're kind of coming at, if you're trying to interact with, if you're trying to tell people, you know, I don't use this because of this stupid crap that you do, then why on earth am I going to give a damn what you think? I mean, your opinion is of no interest to me. And the most likely outcome is that you'll actually just get some kind of trolling response or just some kind of, that's nice, goodbye, and get blocked and ignored. So if you really want to have a particular feature changed or have a bug reported or something like that, make sure, one, that you're calm when you do it. I mean, I get it. I've been there where you waste, I think it was 6 hours I had on the most recent bug caused by someone else's commits to Rails. Don't write your bug report in the sort of 6.5 hours after you've spent your time sort of bashing your head against the wall chasing this thing down, because what's obvious to you was obviously not obvious to the person who committed the code with the bug in the first place. Just kind of chill out, wait, breathe, and then submit your bug report when it can be nice and relaxed and suggesting the next morning. The second lesson that I've learned running these projects is that users make the best contributors, but there's an asterisk here. Now, the reason that users make the best contributors is that in the same way that you should listen to them because they're going to tell you useful things, they're actually much more motivated to fix the things which have been annoying them. So a user who has noticed, well, this particular thing that I have to do every single day, you know, it's really annoying how when I write a migration for the database, I have to say that on the way up, I have to add the column name and it's a string, and on the way down, I have to say remove the column name. Like, why can't you just figure that crap out for yourself automatically? So they'll add fixes, they'll contribute patches which have actually annoyed them. It solves a problem that they actually have, and you can kind of project out from some number of users. You can kind of assume that if it's helping one user, then it's probably helping a bunch of other users. And one of the sort of nice side effects of all of this thing about having users as your contributors is that kind of your contributors are a tiny subset of your users, but as you get more users, you get more contributors. So this is just fantastic. But there's a problem. Our users are developers, and developers like to rewrite stuff all the time. And so this is a pull request. I kind of removed the initial guy's name because he's a nice guy, but he submitted this thing saying, I would like it, there was one line of code which I had added which said, if this array isn't empty, then do something else. And he submitted a pull request saying, hey, instead of if not empty, why don't you use if there are any items in the list? And I was like, well, sure, okay, maybe that was important, but it's not worth my time to click the commit and merge it in. It's just, who cares? 6 people were going back and forth having conversations about all this kind of nonsense about, you know, is this the most important thing? Is it actually perhaps faster because a compiler theoretically, you know, we don't actually have a compiler in Ruby. A compiler could theoretically optimize away. I was like, oh, what the hell? So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this phrase of bike shedding, where someone's done all the work in order to actually build this lovely bike shed. And then once it's been built, all the things are there, the foundation's been laid, it's a crap ton of work, everyone starts coming along going, well, why is it green? Shouldn't it be red? It should be red. I think the things next to it are red. What about blue? We've got to consider blue. Developers are chronic for this, and again, this is a case where GitHub comments are such a mixed blessing. So to take the sort of most recent example of internet drama that has annoyed me, we had a change here which Xavier, guy who lives in Spain, he's one of the Rails core team members, made a while ago. He noticed that our definition for whether or not a request was an AJAX request was that if the X requested with header doesn't not match the following regular expression, then it's an AJAX request. And he just kind of committed, well, that's a bit stupid, I'll get rid of the not and make it if it matches. That's great. Now, for those of you who aren't Ruby programmers, in Ruby there are two things which are false in a sort of Boolean context. The literal false and nil. Everything else is true. And so one of the things that Ruby libraries like us and like the standard library and everything else get to do is that you don't actually have to focus on returning true or false. You just have to return a value which evaluates to true, which means you can return additional information. And so in the case here, by switching it out to use this regular expression matching instead of not doesn't match, the value went from returning always a true or a false, just the two literals there, to sometimes, if it did match, it would return the index of the string at which that point matched. So sometimes it would return 1, sometimes it would return 0. In Ruby, both of those are true, so it doesn't matter, and all of the tests pass and everyone's happy. But some poor guy was passing the raw value that was returned by that straight to some JSON API which serialized and ended up in, I don't know, somewhere. And in JavaScript, 0 is false. And so the value that we were returning kind of ruined his day. Now, it was a really easy fix, and he sent in a relatively innocent comment on this thing saying, I'm just wondering if you guys noticed that it would do this particular thing, which is kind of annoying for my use case. So that was okay. He commented, and it's like, well, there's thousands of Boolean operations in our library. We can't really go through and make every single one of them only ever returning these literal values. So I realize it kind of ruined your day, but it's not practical for us to make that change. And I should point out, of course, this guy noticed this like 18 months after the change was made. It's not like this was noticed the next day. 34 other people then started chiming in saying, this is terrible. There's no way you should be returning 0 from this. It's unbelievable. I can't believe how amateur you guys are. And by piling on and on and on and on and on, and they just kept going and going, and we got pull requests to revert it. We got people who were constructing ludicrous performance characteristics, performance tests saying it's slower on 2 out of 3 Ruby implementations. Like, really? Is determining whether or not your request is an AJAX request the slowest part of your application? Because I want your application. So the lesson that I hope you guys can take away is that, you know, the bike sheet is green. Just get over it. It's just not that important, you know. When you're faced with a piece of code and you're looking at it for the first time, you will always see things which you think could be done better. And when you're using a library or you're using a piece of code, you will always find things that are annoying and that you wish you didn't have to do. But as developers, we kind of all seem to live somewhere on the autism spectrum, and so we don't have the ability to sort of block out the fact that, yeah, it's annoying that this thing is returning 0 in some circumstances, but turns out every other line of code that I use is really awesome, and I'm happy, and my web apps work, and I get to deliver value to my customers. Often all we can see is it's returning 0 sometimes. That's unacceptable. And look at this. They've been told about it by like 33 people. I should chime in order to make that make it really clear that they're aware that there's this problem. And in reality, the way that that comes across to an open source maintainer is instead of, you know, being sort of an I'm Spartacus moment, a whole bunch of people standing up saying, I am also offended by this, it just eventually comes across like a bunch of either crying spoiled children, I think was what I used, was the phrase I used to describe these people, and that didn't go down well, or like an angry mob, and then you're kind of like, well, fuck you guys, I'm doing this for free. What exactly am I putting up with this nonsense for? And so, yeah, just please. So focus your attention, focus your fixes on small digestible things. Focus on the minor annoyances. If those are the things that you're trying to contribute towards, things that are actually annoying you, not things that are kind of like academic in annoyance, things that are One that we had a whole long thread about recently was whether or not using put for partial updates to REST resource is compliant with RFC something. And the number of people who were just going back and forth and sort of, it felt like I was at some kind of Bible camp where they were just kind of each quoting different passages and kind of using that to justify their thing, and then this other guy was saying, well, actually, I'll quote this other thing and I can justify that, None of them, not a single person ever had an example of, this broke my application because of this thing. And when we hear those kind of reports, when we hear, this thing is broken for the following reasons, or my day was ruined because, then we're much more likely to take that seriously. So yeah, when you're reporting your bugs, when you're suggesting improvements, always focus on a concrete example. Never, we get bug reports with people who've got tables called foo and bar and all these other things, and then they're kind of like, and then there's this relationship between foo and bar where only bars with certain values of foo are accessible, and it's impossible for us to reason about, and it's impossible for us to realize just actually whether this thing is important. Whereas if you take a cut down version of your application and explain it that way, it'll be much, much more likely to be accepted. And please, never ever think that clicking on a thread where there's hundreds of people contributing already is actually adding any value. So there's this kind of thing where, I think it came from Apache and we inherited it, where when people are in favor of a change, they can vote +1. If you're opposed to a change, you can vote -1. And you kind of add those up using some committee thing, and Apache decides whether or not to apply a particular change. And so we tried that for our patches for a while, but most people's contribution was no other words, no explanations, just +1 or -1, and that's actually useless. And so we just kind of ignored all of that thing and phased it out. So if you're looking to add comments to an existing bug report or feature request or anything, if what you're looking to submit is anything other than here's another separate case which you possibly haven't considered, just don't bother. It's really not adding any value. Just subscribe to the bug report and you'll see where it goes. And in order to put things in perspective, this is my GitHub count right now. I don't read any of these things because, really, it's 4,800 and something, and I cleared them over Christmas. So when you're piling onto these threads, it's not actually notifying the people that need to see it. It's just spamming emails to everyone else who's contributed in an angry manner to that discussion. And so you're all just kind of working yourselves into a frenzy, and I'm completely sitting here blissfully unaware that any of this kind of nonsense is going on. So just don't. So lesson number 3 for us was it's really important to listen to your contributors. And the reason is that your contributors are kind of like super users. So after someone's submitted 2, 3, 4, 5 patches, they've done some horrible work that you didn't want to do, like maybe upgraded a dependency that we had on a library that, they shipped a new version. The gist of it is that they're kind of like users that you can actually trust a little bit more than the regular users. But there's a problem here. As your project scales, you start out in this situation where there's an enormous amount of work to do and there's a small number of volunteers. And as your project grows, hey, sweet, you hit equilibrium. You've got the right number of volunteers for the amount of work that needs to be done. You can just basically churn on forwards and everyone's happy. But if your project's good, then you're going to keep attracting users. Contributors are a fraction of your total user base. Therefore, eventually you find yourself with more volunteers or more time being volunteered than there is actually work to be done. And in our case, where it grew like a weed, we ended up with so many more people who wanted to contribute than there was actually work for them to do. And this is a serious problem. So what we did was we kind of ignored the patches. So this is a screenshot taken from 2006. So we had this problem for a long time. Stale tickets were tickets that were reported over 3 months ago, had a patch attached, and hadn't had a comment on them since. There were 1,500 of these things. We simply didn't have the time in order for us to both do the work that we needed to do to push Rails forward and to sort of do all of the community management and interaction and mailing lists and bug checkers and everything else. So this is a really hard problem, and our solution to it was to just kind of ignore the problem and hope that it goes away. And we were in a privileged position because we had, if I go backwards, we were here. So if we annoyed 98% of our volunteers, it didn't actually matter. And if they all went away, then, well, you know, I'm sorry that we offended you, but it didn't make a material difference to us. We still had those people, we still had enough contributors to get the work done. If you're in a situation, though, where you're thinking of submitting patches or bug reports or whatever it is, just consider that there's an awful lot of work that's actually involved there. Now, one of the things that we've kind of realized is that contributors will leave. You know, we've had people who worked on Rails who, one worked at the thing called Measure Map, which eventually turned into the new UI for Google Analytics, and he does C++ something or other all day now. You know, people start, they do some work, and they leave. And it's just kind of the natural flow of things. Now, unfortunately, for us, the people who were leaving because we were screwing up the patches queue and weren't looking after these things, we were able to sort of write them off in our mind as like, well, you know, people leave, it's not a big deal. And it became a big deal for us. What we actually had, and it seems I deleted the slide accidentally, is that we had people who were so angry about how we were managing their contributions, or mismanaging to be fair, that they started an entirely alternative Ruby web development framework, which was largely just a different implementation of the exact same ideas, and that's just not a productive thing. I mean, I know that the Java guys and the Python guys do that all the time, and it's just kind of normal, but for us, at the time, it was very unusual. You know, Ruby and Rails were fortunate in that when we launched, there were not enough Ruby programmers to give a critical mass to more than one web development framework. So we had one. We were growing, and we had everyone basically, you know, whatever the phrase is, wood behind the arrow, pushing in the same direction. But we had 27 Python clones of Rails. And I'm not making that up, that's a number. We used to have a chart and everything. And so that kind of fragmentation meant that even though there are still tons more Python programmers than there are Ruby programmers, there were too few of them contributing to too many different projects that basically they never got anywhere. So anyway, that was a complete distraction. I have no idea why I said that. But the lessons for you, if you're going to be a helpful contributor, is that what's actually the most valuable way, if you want to contribute to a project, is to do the kind of horrible stuff. So if you look at a bug tracker for a typical open source project, like the Cassandra database that Aaron works on, or for Rails, or for anything, there'll be a whole lot of people who don't really know what the hell it is that they're doing, who are reporting bugs. Just kind of like, why do I get this thing? Paste in a third of the stack trace, omitting the place where the error is raised and the relevant call stack. So, you know, I can't really do anything with that. They've described what they've sort of transliterated what they think the error message was. You know, I got an error message saying blah, 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 blah. And you search for that exact string and it's nowhere in the entire code base. So you know that they haven't copied and pasted that. They've just kind of recited it from memory. You know, these bug reports, a lot of them are just because there are a lot of stupid people on the internet and they don't know what they're doing. And kind of, that's okay. They're probably doing something dumb, and it's probably better served by telling them to open a question on Stack Overflow and get help from the hordes of stupid idiots that live over there. But in some rare number of cases, they are actually reporting a legitimate bug, and they're just not qualified to figure out how to describe that in a way that's useful to me. Now, that doesn't mean that the bug isn't there. So one of the most valuable ways that a user can contribute to an open source project, in my mind, is to actually go through, find a bug report where you look at it and you think, what the hell is this guy going on? And then start interacting with the person who reported it. Say, hey, you know, can you give me an example of your application? Can you give me the whole stack trace? Can you reproduce it in multiple browsers? You know, all these kind of things that if you're a tester at on a commercial software project, that's kind of your job, but we don't have those people in open source projects. That's the stuff which takes up an enormous amount of the contributors' time, of the maintainers' time, and it's something which you can just kind of dip in and out of, and that's much more valuable work than kind of giving us a patch to implement some little bike shedding related feature. The other piece of advice I'd give is just generally don't be too precious about the bug reports that you've made. So in the case of the guy with the if not doesn't match thing, he made a report and he said, you know, this broke my application and I'm not too happy about it, but I realize that it's been 18 months since you made this change, and so, you know, it doesn't really matter. It was a one character fix to my application and I'm happy. But other people then who were who were submitting their anger as pull requests to revert the change or alternative changes, or just update the documentation to make it clear, warning, sometimes this will return a value that you don't expect, when we would close their pull request to be just like, look, I'm not interested in talking about this, it's just not that important, goodbye, hopefully in a slightly nicer way than that, but probably not by that stage, these guys would take that really personally, from their perspective, and I guess from any contributor's perspective. You spend a lot of time working on a patch or working to reproduce a bug report or writing it all down, and you submit this. That's the one thing that you spend an enormous amount of time on, but we have sort of 900 of those things in the bug database, and so if I was to try to spend the same amount of time on every bug report as the submitted did, unfortunately, that simply doesn't scale and would probably process 1 or 2 different bugs a month, and that's kind of acceptable for the space shuttle, which has 5 or 6 in its lifetime. It's not acceptable for an open source project, and we're human, right? So I had a case where I made a jackass out of myself recently, where we had a bug report from someone describing an obscure cryptography problem with one of our libraries that we use. And I know enough about cryptography to know that I know very little about cryptography, but that I know more than 99% of people, because I've had horrible, horrible crypto bugs ship in code that I looked after. Now, so this guy reported it. It was worded kind of poorly, and I thought, oh, well, thanks, but I'd prefer to hear from someone who's a cryptographer or a cryptologist, and blah, 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 blah. Submit, close, and move on. And anyway, so he reopens the ticket and says, I have a PhD in cryptography, and I work on the Google crypto security team, and I am telling you that this is a problem. I am not suggesting that it might be a problem. And so, whoops. Turns out the reason it wasn't very well worded is because he's Vietnamese and that's his first language, and I had just made a sort of initial judgment of going, dumb, close. And strictly speaking, almost everyone who maintains stuff, you kind of make that horrible Malcolm Gladwell thing where you make that kind of snap judgment of the decision that the bug that you've been reported, you say yes or no, no, it just doesn't look that important. And then you either close it, if you're being honest with the people who contribute, or if you kind of take the librarian approach where every bug report is special and should stay open for all time, you just kind of ignore it and you're never going to look at it again. So statistically or realistically speaking, that bug report is closed, but it's open and so no one's going to get offended. So, I kind of messed up in that case, and he was perfectly happy to come back and say, you're a douchebag, here's my credentials, I know what I'm talking about, I could open the bug and we could all move on. Too many people who contribute to open source projects, when someone like me makes a horrible mistake like that, well, instead of just reopening the ticket and saying, actually, here's the reasons why it's a big deal, we'll just get really offended and walk away and never contribute again. And I realize that in an ideal world, everyone would be, given a flower when they contribute their first thing, and we'd shake your hand and say, thanks, we really appreciate this. But just the sheer mathematics of having 900 odd open patches and growing at whatever it is, like 100 a week, we can't. And no large open source project can actually give that kind of face-to-face personal service, I guess you could say, if you were in the sort of hotel business, of looking after every contributor. So we're going to have to do mass management things, we're going to mess it up. And just, if you realize that from our perspective, we're not actually able to do this, then hopefully you can understand when we mess up and just, persevere. But at the same time, if I mess up and then I continue to mess up because I'm an idiot and this is the kind of thing that I'll do, that one bug that you've reported that I'm not going to fix, it's probably been there for a while, and it's really not the end of the world if it doesn't get fixed. You can either maintain your own patch that you can deploy, or you can work around it yourself in the way that everyone else obviously is. So if we close your stuff, if any contributor, I guess it's not just Rails, I mean most people here aren't going to contribute to Rails and that's fine, but when we mess up, please just don't take it too personally, I guess is the gist. So I've got a couple of other lessons that aren't necessarily that interesting in terms of lessons that you can use, but which I generally like to pull out. So the typical example that you're told when you start reading about open source is that one of the reasons open source is really successful is that you release early and often. But that's actually nonsense. And the reason that's nonsense is that you actually only have one chance to make a first impression. And if that first impression of yours is a tarball which only builds on Ubuntu Linux because you forgot to make sure that you were supporting some obscure different version of AutoConf, or it won't build on Clang so Mac users can't use it, you've only got this one chance for someone to download your thing and go, this is interesting, I'm looking forward to contributing, or this is terrible and I'm not going to help. So the typical advice that you get is to release early and often, but I really can't stress enough that that's just generally a terrible idea. You know, the real advice should be release early, but not too early, and often, but not too often, because who wants to spend their life sort of following up on bug reports and upgrading their framework every single week? I mean, you know, we kind of messed up this as a Rails project. We move very quickly, and we do that deliberately. We kind of, and the line I like to use is that with us, unlike Java, deprecation means deprecation. It is gone in the next release. It will not work. It's not like Java util date, where you can still set hour, month, day, year, and all these things. They've been deprecated since JDK 1.1, but still it will continue to work. So we like to move. We like to keep things moving, and that means that there's a certain amount of sort of upgrade friction which users have to put up with every single release. And we still think that we've got the balance right there. People obviously who haven't ever had to maintain an open source project will like it to be completely painless and every upgrade to always just be drop in and have it go, but that's just not practical. The other lesson that we've kind of learned is that it's important to just ignore the trolls. Now, unfortunately, not all trolls are entirely as obvious as this guy. Essentially, every comment on Reddit on any programming topic is a troll. That's what I've learned. Literally every comment on Hacker News about anything is a troll. So my advice if you're looking to maintain a project is you can't be bothered with what these people are saying about your application. There's no point. You know, there's this kind of view that the Y Combinator, well, Y Combinator is fine, but the Hacker News people are some kind of ivory tower god programmers who know how to implement virtual machines that run on phones and, I don't know, whatever kind of geek macho cred they need to get. The reality is that they're mostly just grumpy, angry teenagers in their parents' basement. And so if you find yourself commenting on Reddit threads or Hacker News threads or blog posts that aren't on the main project's blog, you're not actually contributing anything to that discussion. I'm not going to see that. My maintainers aren't going to see that. The reality is that it's just not really worth your while to be involved in Hacker News at all. I actually have Hacker News in my hosts file. I can't visit it even if people try to accidentally link me to it. The other piece of advice that we've got, and this is something that I know commercial guys talk about as well, is that you should ignore your competitors. There's kind of always in our history been the alternative to Rails, whatever that is. It's a PHP thing sometimes, it's a Java thing sometimes. Whoever it is, there's an alternative, and that's great. But we pay absolutely no attention to those guys. They're going off and they're doing whatever they're doing. They're evolving in different directions. I mean, in the early days of Rails and Django, people would think that those two were competitors, but they've kind of evolved in such different directions now that they serve a very different market segment. And so you shouldn't ignore them entirely. There's generally a kernel of something interesting going on. You know, when you see someone saying, here's my new web development framework and it's fast, then, well, maybe we should work on performance. Or here's my new web development framework and it's really easy to set up on Windows. Like, well, maybe we should make sure it even works on Windows. I mean, I assume that it does. So yeah, ignore your competitors, but mostly ignore your competitors. There's something valuable there, generally speaking. So anyway, I'm out of time and I'm also at the end of my slides. So I hope that there's been some useful information there. I'm a little bit worried in my kind of sleep-deprived state that will have come across as the rantings of an angry, arrogant man. But hopefully there's been something practical out of that. And yeah, if you have any questions, I guess come up and get me afterwards because we're going to do this panel discussion thing now. But thanks.